so just to put that question aside of what an actuary is. So one answer is an actuary is someone who can brighten up any party just by leaving. So that puts the context. Really what actuaries do, which I really love, is we apply maths and statistics to matters of risk. So I work for an insurance company in Glasgow, and we provide medical malpractice insurance for doctors and dentists. So I do all the work and my team on how much they have to pay us, and then making sure we've got enough money to pay out when, unfortunately, things from time to time, don't worry about going to doctor and dentist, still keep going, something goes wrong. So that's all that analysis to make sure we've got enough capital, etc. So that's what I do. In which case you might be thinking, why is there an actuary here talking about the economics of childbearing? Reason is that about getting on to 20 years ago now, I took a sabbatical year out of my actuarial career to go to London School of Economics to do a Master's in Population Development. I've always been interested in demography. And in those days, it was all about overpopulation and concerns about that sort of thing. But I thought that'd be interesting to go and get a bit more sort of academic boundaries to some of the ideas I had. Following that, I then combined working as an actuary with teaching at the LSE in demography for a few years until I moved back to Scotland. And I've just kept that up. And now that sort of two trains of thought come together in really the topic of the ageing populations that we've got in most, if not all, Western countries and many what we call developing countries. And I'm involved in some actuarial working groups looking precisely at that topic, as are many other groups, think tanks around the UK and elsewhere. So that's what brings it together. And a couple of weeks ago, I gave a seminar more on that, focused more on that idea of low birth rates and what's happening in UK, the other countries, and worldwide. This is taking a little bit of a step back, although there is overlap. And when we come to the questions, if you want to move on to the area of low birth rates and implications, causes, etc., all those come up as well here. More than happy to do so. But really, what I wanted to use this as an opportunity to sort of dig into a little bit more about the economics of childbearing. And one of the things I find fascinating about this topic is that you can look at it as a sort of purely theoretical economic subject, but it's also intensely personal. It's one of these issues that the implications of the decisions that individuals make can be really far-reaching. Millions and millions of men and women making decisions about whether to have children or not, all that comes together, macroeconomic policy issues. I think that combination of really intensely personal and that sort of theoretical I find fascinating. And one of the questions that I'm just beginning to bubble over in my mind is that question about almost the Adam Smith invisible hand, is to what extent all those decisions that individuals are making are contributing to, we could say, the common good in some sense. And if it's not, for example, not having enough children to support a country, that's a concern. What should be done about it? But we'll come back to that towards the end. Anyway, one thing I'm also interested in, and I gave a lecture on this at the British Society of Population Studies last year, is the fact that what we're discussing now about ageing populations, low fertility, is something that the UK and other countries were very concerned about 100 years ago. And in fact, some of the rhetoric is almost identical. What Elon Musk was saying about this ageing population, low birth rates being the biggest issue, was actually almost word for word the same as what Franklin D. Roosevelt, as vice president, was saying back in the early 1900s. And lots of other issues are concerned. And Keynes was saying, this was 1937, a little bit before Second World War, but even the baby boom that people think started after Second World War actually began just before Second World War, saying that actually, he said, it's all over, we're going to have a declining population, nothing's going to change. How wrong he was. He didn't foresee Second World War, or well, at least if he foresaw it, didn't realise what the demographic impact would have been with the post-war increase in fertility. So, brief agenda. So why is childbearing of interest to economists? As economists, not as husbands and wives and mums and dads. Okay? A few theoretical frameworks, just to sort of talk about some of the things, ideas that people put forward, and then what sort of policy responses have been proposed in that area of low birth rates, and what are the effects of those. So why is it of interest to economists? And if any of the content, hopefully you don't feel insulted by what I've written up here, but It says, economists, perhaps like actuaries, like to model everything. They've got some response variable, number of children, and therefore what are the independent variables and how they link together, and let's build a regression model and let's see what we can do. Turning individuals into a piece of mathematics, which as a mathematician I think has got some value, but only goes so far. Also there's a reductionist view of childbearing just becomes another process within a social structure. And again, some economists like to be able to do that through these, they can get their hands around it, they can build a model and work with it. But also there are macroeconomic implications, and big ones and significant ones, and policy implications. So for economists, politicians, social scientists in general, I think there's a lot there that people can get hold of. And economists have always been interested in this topic, and two of them there you know very well, Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus, having completely different views about the impact on population. So Smith thinking that any population would always just grow up to, or expand to what the resources can provide for, whereas Malthus actually go beyond that. Some people say you've got two economists up here, you've only got two opinions rather than three, but anyway. And then a little quote from Keynes about how these ideas have been floating around for ages, and we're all having in our mind to some extent. And some of you may have seen, was it Paul Ehrlich, died, famous for his book Population Bomb from the late 1960s. And it's one of the sort of obituaries I read about. It says, it's amazing how someone can be so wrong for such a long career and still do very well out of it. So again, but those ideas seep into the discourse and the narratives. So I'm presenting some graphs, but this graph of dependency ratios, and I'll explain some of the problems with that in a second, probably encapsulates some of the economics issues that relate to childbearing. So this definition of dependency ratios, and this is from the Financial Times, February of this year, there is so much in the media about low birth rates, implications, aging populations at the moment. It's incredible. So this is dependency ratios, both ends of the age range. So it's those up to 19, so you're dependent, I'm afraid. Sorry. And anyone over the age of 64 is a dependent. Sorry. Purely a mathematical construct, okay? Because there are many people who are working, contributing, both before the age of 19 and after the age of 64. And they may not be working, but they're looking after parents, enabling younger people to go to work, etc., etc., etc. But they have to put some line somewhere just to be able to model something. And as you can see from the 1950s, high dependency ratios, mainly because lots of children. Then as those children aged and fertility rates came down, people weren't living quite so long as we are now, dependency ratios dropped. But then they are now inextricably rising in all countries, some more quickly than others, more steeply than others. And China, you can see the blue one, oops. China is a dark blue, you can see that came down very quickly, one-child policy, and low reduced fertility anyway, but then very quickly aging precisely because of one-child policy, it very soon catches up with one. And obviously it will tip over because then the older people start dying off, and therefore, to some extent, it will revert down depending on exactly what happens to the demography. But certainly over the next 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to be an increasing dependency ratio with potential impacts financially, socially, on health and pensions, but we'll come back to that. So some theoretical frameworks, and one of the most well-known ones is this quantity versus quality. And this is itself explaining how people make childbearing decisions, especially as countries develop, get richer, and individuals within those countries get richer. So Gary Becker, writing in the 1960s, was saying that looking at children as a consumption good. I mean, he made the comment that this was just him as a theoretician. You know, he didn't think of them just as goods like a washing machine or a car or anything like that. He realised they were more important than that, but for the point of his analysis, he's saying, let's treat them as consumption goods. And the number of children that parents would want to have will be influenced by things like the taste, how many they want. Be cultural, religious, social, peer group, and so on affects the decisions to have children. Also the quality there's that idea that your parents have that idea, well, if we have fewer children, we can educate them better, we can give them more material goods, we can have a better house, we can live in a better area of the city, the town, whatever it might be. All those things coming together. Therefore, if we have fewer children, we can afford more for the children that are there. And I'll come back to this little sting in the tail at the end of this presentation. We'll come back to this sort of quality versus quantity issue. And then income. And it was interesting at the 1960s that he was saying that it's likely that a rise in long-term income would increase the amount spent on children. And he was actually thinking also in terms of there being more children. Actually, a rise in income would actually increase the number of children. But actually, as I think people are actually aware of pretty much now, is that there is a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but correlation between the level of development, how rich a country is, which is up this axis, and the fertility rate. So the higher the fertility rate tends to be in those countries which are less developed, which are poorer in these financial terms. Whereas those countries which are richer financially, in terms of GDP, they tend to have lower fertility. That doesn't mean that necessarily within a country that works. And also there's some evidence that as a country gets past a certain level of GDP, actually fertility rates can go up again. So it's a little bit of a U-shape. But in broad terms, there is that link between being richer and having fewer children, or being financially poorer and low GDP and having more children. Then Becker moved on a little bit in his thinking, and there's some other authors as well. And look, it wasn't just purely about income and about, say, the male breadwinner bringing in more, or a country being richer. But there was sort of more nuance there. And things like female education, so women going or staying in school longer, means they don't get married as early, and therefore they don't have as many children. If a girl doesn't get married until she's in her mid-20s, or becomes a partner these days, within the mid-20s, she's not going to have as many children on average as someone who was married at the age of 18. So it's just that difference. The fact that women are working and are having a career, which also means they delay setting up a family, getting married, having a partner, also just delaying having children in order to develop that career. So again, that reduces the time over which you will have children, and therefore there'll be fewer children. If there's no childcare available, much, especially family are not available to provide childcare, which is free in some sense, and therefore one has to pay for childcare, then again that gives an opportunity cost of coming out of the labour force and therefore not earning in order to look after children. And then there was an interesting analysis that was done looking at, and it may seem a bit strange, the relative price of butter and grain. What does that have to do with fertility? Well, in the country where they did this analysis, the butter was produced by the women and the grain was produced by the farmers, which were the men. And the change in the relative price of those changed the relative value of female and male labour. And therefore that had an impact on the keenness of which women were to have children. So it's sort of a natural experiment of how that links together. And then finally, on these theoretical frameworks, and these overlap, they're not all distinct or even antagonistic theories. There's a lot of overlap between them, is that childbearing and I suppose economics in a wider sense comes down to negotiation between man and woman, husband and wife, on who's going to do what in the house. And there's an issue, and this affects societies such as South Korea, where they've got a modern workforce, so men and women having equal opportunities in the workforce. Women go to university as much as, perhaps even more than the men, careers. But the careers in somewhere like South Korea, the work-life balance is not great. Work very many hours, very sort of tough environment, especially in the more highly paid professions. But they still have a traditional home life culture. So the woman is still expected to do the bulk of the housework and looking after the children and so on. And therefore women are saying, well, actually, we're not prepared to accept that. We want the modern side of things, but if the husband wants a child, well, you're going to have to take more share of the work. And the husband's can't cope with that either. And therefore they end up either not getting married in the first place, and women not having children, or they they basically end up with much lower fertility. So and that seems to be also be playing out in countries which have that mixture of modern workforce, traditional home life, Spain in some places, Italy, and you can see that these also have certainly not as low as fertility as low as South Korea, but certainly lower compared to the rest of Europe. So looking at South Korea, this started off in 1950, fertility rate of 6. So just in case you're not aware, when we talk about fertility rate, this is calculated by taking the individual fertility rates of women of different ages from 15 to 45 broadly, and then adding it up. So it's over a particular year. So 2026, you look at how many children did 15-year-olds have, 16-year-olds, 17, on average, and you add it up, and that gives you the average fertility rate. What that doesn't tell us is what's going to happen in the future, because the number of children that a 25-year-old is having now won't be the same number as a 25-year-old have in 5 years' time, because the social things change. So it's a sort of point in time estimate, which is called a period rate, rather than trying to look forward, which is a cohort rate. But this is the best we can do, because we can get that number now. So this is the South Korea. And as you can see, it started off about 6 back in the 1950s and has just inexorably fallen. It's now down to maybe 0.7. Actually, it was 0.7 2 years ago. It's actually just popped up a little bit. It was 0.8 last year. Partly because when fertility falls, what's happening broadly is that women are having babies later. So in South Korea, you're getting perhaps a slightly higher proportion of women at those older ages having babies. So it's just the way the maths is working through. So it's gone up to 0.8. There's something called the replacement rate. So if a country, nation, wants to maintain its population stable, absent immigration or emigration, it needs a fertility rate broadly about 2.1. You can, why 2.1 and not 2? It's 2.1 because it's the number of the average number of children that a woman who goes through the whole of her childbearing years will have. And the 0.1 is there to cover those women that don't make it all the way through. So it's that little bit extra, because not everyone gets through. And also because there are, in most countries, a few more boys born compared to women. So for every 100 women or baby girls born, probably about 105 boys are born. So if a woman wants to have one daughter, she has to have a little bit more than 2 children to get that one daughter. So South Korea is at 0.7. So its population does not replace itself, and every generation will be a third the size. It really is quite dramatic. So what sort of policy responses that one could, and there's 2 broad levels in this, then look at it. One is to accept the low fertility, and the other is to try to do something about it. So on this slide, start with assuming that we say, well, fertility is what it is. We're not going to get involved. Some politicians have decided that actually low fertility for a country is not a good idea, and so they try to do things. But in the UK, Starmer has said he doesn't want to dictate what people do in the bedroom. And Phillipson, the education minister, although she says that this is an issue, and obviously if you don't have children, there's not going to be much of the education department left after a few years. She says, well, again, we're trying to make it easier for people to have children, but we're not going to force them to do anything. So if you accept low fertility, what happens? Well, dependency ratios will go up at the higher age. So obviously you'll have fewer children, so there'll be less investment required in children, so that will come down. But generally, older people are more expensive than younger people. Healthcare, dementia. This Goodhart and Pradham book talks about dementia and the costs of that. So saying that that's really big impact on finances and they say, and we're just not ready for that. So big impact there. One might want to fill the gaps with immigration, but you have to keep doing that. If you keep having low fertility, to keep the numbers up, you have to keep having more and more immigrants, which is great, and they're here in this room. but then one has to accept the social implications and the cultural implications of that. And also one has to think about, well, are we just taking people from other countries who are perhaps better off in other countries? You know, we're creaming off doctors and nurses or whatever from developing countries and potentially having a negative impact on their healthcare. So because we're getting them sort of free of charge. So all of that. Pension schemes, so it's both state and public. So the state pension scheme, as there are fewer working age people who are paying their taxes, then that's going to make the payment of pension schemes landing on fewer people. Sometimes people think that the state pension being paid out by national insurance contributions, I've paid for my pension, I'm just sort of drawing it down like if we put money in the bank account. It doesn't work like that. You know, that money we put into national insurance last year, year before, actually it's spent. So your pensions, those that have got pensions or the pension that you will get from the state in due course, will be paid for by the taxpayers at that time, at least in the UK. Other countries have different systems, but in the UK it is the taxpayers at that time. And therefore there will be decisions about things like pension age, at what age will people be able to take state pension. At the moment for me it would be 67. If we want to keep the proportions of people getting state pension to the working population, it would probably need to go up to 75 or so over the coming decades. So just imagine people having to work through to 75. Sorry. But then, or you can reduce the value of it. So at the moment we have this thing called the triple lock. So each year it goes up in line with the rate of 2.5% prices and wages. But to take some of that away, so it doesn't go up as fast as that. Obviously, a brave government to do that, especially as older people are much better at voting. A higher proportion of older people vote. So one of the things that one haven't got on here, one has to accept, is potential impact on democracy and decisions about. Doesn't mean that all older people are very conservative and therefore they're going to vote reform. I don't think it works quite simply as that. But there's certain elements there that one has to think through. Similarly, healthcare, provision of healthcare to older people. I mentioned dementia. And also it's a case of not just the financing of it, but actually who's going to do the work? Who is going to provide that health care? If you need a lot of it and you haven't got the workforce, well, how are you going to take it from, or what are they going to stop doing in order to look after the older people? However, as Martin Wolf says, AI and robotics will come to our solution, our salvation. To some extent, I think that's true. I think there will be more robotics, and I think the Japanese are pushing this because they've got to. They've got a very aging population. But it can't do everything. And that care side of things, perhaps particularly, may be more difficult. So we'll have to see. Opposite that, lower innovation. Again, Japan is having fewer patents than it used to have. Because again, older population, not that older people are not innovative and bright, but they're not as dynamic and energetic as the younger people coming through. So if the younger people coming through, they have more. And just mathematically, if we have fertility rates below replacement globally, the population of the world will die, the human population of the world will die out. It's just the maths. Now, it will take quite a while, and I certainly won't be around. And you won't be around either, so there's plenty of but it is just, and Elon Musk, for all his faults, it says, it would be a shame that South Korea, there's no more South Koreans left. Yes. On the other hand, one could have policy responses. Say, no, we want to do something about this. And I think there is that philosophical question about to what extent is there a moral duty on people to have children for the sake of the community? I think that might be something to come back to in discussion. So a number of countries, about 30% of countries it seems, have tried to reverse low fertility through various policies of one sort or another. Baby bonuses, so governments giving some $5,000, 10,000 Singaporean dollars, whatever it is, at birth to try to encourage their population to have more children. These can sort of help a little bit. It doesn't seem, most of these things actually don't move the dial very much. at best, I would say most of these things stop it getting worse. So without policy that people have tried to implement, fertility rate could have been even lower, but it's not really pushed them much. Certainly not up to replacement level or even anywhere near that. Tax breaks. So Hungary, if a woman has 3 children, she doesn't have to pay any more income tax. And similarly, Singapore got something similar. Subsidising childcare. So if something that's putting off parents having children is that trade-off where if I have another child, I have to stop working, or we have to pay for childcare and we can't afford that. Well, if the government comes in and subsidises childcare, then maybe that will help incentivise people to have more children, and similarly subsidise professional housing if it's available. Again, part of the problem in Russia is that housing stock is so small. There is no room to have more than one child, and that's just causing part of the problem. Or there can be cultural encouragement, which sometimes borders on the pornographic in some countries. These sort of adverts that governments put in place to try to encourage people to have more children. The one I like is in Australia. I think about 2010, the Minister of Finance came out with, because they were worried about their low fertility rate, said, well, trying to boost it, he said, well, we should have Australians have 3 children, 1 for mum, 1 for dad, and 1 for Australia. And fast forward about 15 years, and they're having half for mum, half for dad, half for Australia. It hasn't really worked. Martin Wolf, who again has been writing on this last couple of a few weeks, has made noise about this sort of forcing people to go back into, if it ever was the case, the Middle Ages, that women are sort of chained to the kitchen sink, and all they're there for is to have children. Which I don't think wasn't acceptable then, not acceptable now anyway. So France has been really interesting. France was at the forefront of the drop in fertility rates from the 17th century onwards, partly because it was very centralised, and parents in the rural areas, which was most of France, realised that if they wanted their children to develop, they needed to be able to send them to Paris or the big cities, and that was expensive, so they already started limiting their fertility way before modern contraception or abortion became widespread. So you can see here, it's the same size graph as for South Korea, but it's starting at 3 rather than 6. And then fertility dropped down from 65, so that would be conception coming in, abortion coming in France, as in many other countries around the same sort of time. But they were very concerned and that they would reduce fertility before this graph, but they kept getting beaten in war, mainly by Germany and Prussia. So they've always had a more pronatalist view from the state, and have had all sorts of encouragements to people. As you see, it's not had a great impact. Obviously, there was a bit more of an increase early parts of this decade, but it's tailing off again. And Emile Zola wrote a book called Fruitfulness in 1889, and all about trying to, again, here's as an author, culturally trying to encourage people to have more children by making a very positive view of things, but it obviously hasn't had the long run impact. And again, you've got mixed in with this immigration in France we've seen, and sort of the rise of the far right and so on. Then final chart. Now Iceland, this is anecdote, and Iceland's a small country. You can't extrapolate from Iceland to the rest of the world. However, they had a sort of mini natural experiment. In 1989, they had a tax-free year. They were changing their tax code, and for some reason they decided we obviously can afford it for some reason. No one has to pay income tax in the coming 12 months. And there's been all sorts of research on that and impacts on labour supply and this sort. But also more recently, someone's actually been looking at what impacts on fertility. And that reduction in tax, which is equivalent to an increase in income, actually did lead to, sort of 9 months after that law came in, more of a sort of thing, to an increase in fertility rates. So it does have that idea of linking income and however, what it seems to show, and you can see because the graph is more or less doing what France is doing as well, is that a lot of these policies that come in often have a short-term impact. Here it would be a short-term, well, let's have a kid now when we're not paying income because we can afford it now, but we're not going to have any more children than we're expecting. We're still planning to have 2, we just have to have a bit sooner than we're otherwise do. So sometimes there's You have a bit of a blip, but then it comes down. And then, therefore, the sting in the tail, which I think relates to Iceland, is that coming out to this quality versus quantity, is when you have low fertility, and this, that you then people worried about the quality of the child. If we're going to only have one child, we want to make sure it's a good child. And Iceland, for example, have now they say, we have no more Down syndrome children. So tests in womb, and if you've got Down syndrome, it's aborted. Similarly, you had in China with the one-child policy, that there was that son preference. If they're only having one child, they would often abort the girl because they didn't want a girl. So you get that quality versus quantity coming in. And on that thought, I will leave it and open up to discussion and comments.